Good morning. Welcome to the Point. In the 8 months or so that Governor Rick Snyder has left in office, he has a lot he'd still like to get done. We talked to him this week about some of those priorities for the remainder of the year. Governor, it was just about a year ago that a whole bunch of folks went up to the Soo locks to call attention to the fact that the locks are in need of repair and expansion. And I was a little surprised when people started talking about the economic impact those locks have, not just for Michigan, but the entire North American continent and beyond. I know now that President Trump was in town and actually mentioned the locks, and you've taken that opportunity to say, yeah, let's do something about it. What needs to be done?
Yeah, we absolutely need to reinforce that message, Rick. We need another lock. We need redundancy up there, and it's not just a Michigan issue. It's for our national economic security. It's interesting. The Corps of Engineers always just measured the value of kind of the iron ore going through. So they said, okay, that's worth a fair amount of money, but it's not a huge number. What people didn't recognize, and the Department of Homeland Security, we need to thank them, did a studies that say, where does that iron ore go? And it creates the high value steel, not commodity steel, but the high value steel that goes into our autos, goes into our appliances. So if something went down, if that lock went down, the one lock we have that can handle those big ships, we might not be able to produce autos in a good chunk of America or appliances in a good chunk of America after several weeks, and literally could cause millions of unemployment.
What kind of dollar and cent kind of bill are we looking for? Because putting another lock in, compared to what the economic necessity is, probably isn't much, but the initial cost got to be pretty high.
It's significant. It's somewhere probably in the range of $500 million to $1 billion. And again, I'm giving you a wide range because I'm not the engineer doing the work. But it's significant. But if you think about the risk parameters, it's interesting. There's an old story that if you go back to World War II, it was one of the few places in the United States that had anti-aircraft guns and everything in place to protect that lock, because they realized back then how critical it was. That need hasn't changed since World War II. This is critical to our country's economic well-being, to have the ability to make sure that iron ore gets to those steel mills, to make that steel that runs our economic engine for vehicles, appliances, and so many other goods.
I won't belabor it, but the other thing to point out is even if the appropriations were done today, that's still a long-term project.
Still long-term. The ironic part, it was authorized back in the 80s to do the work. They never appropriated the dollars. So let's get the appropriation done and let's get going, because that risk doesn't get any better and the locks aren't getting any younger.
Let's talk about trade. You were just on a mission to Europe. You have been to a number of places talking up Michigan, and each time you come back, you seem to convey the message that people feel better about Michigan. At least the story is easier to tell. What was this trip like?
Oh, absolutely. It keeps improving, and I'll give you one benchmark I like to use is I signed 3 agreements, memorandums of understanding about how we can partner on mobility, autonomous and connected vehicles. But the big difference in these agreements were, one was with a state in Austria, Styria, but the other 2 agreements were with national governments of countries. Think about that. The country of the UK, the country of the Netherlands, want to sign agreements with the state of Michigan because they view us as the world's leader and they want to partner with us. I think that sends a very strong message to say we're getting recognized as the go-to place and the go-to partner for one of the most critical future revolutions happening in our society that's going to create economic opportunity but also challenges. We're leading it now, let's keep leading, and let's keep doing agreements like this across the world.
When that business grows, when its footprint gets bigger and bigger and bigger, one of the things that will be interesting to see is how well we can adapt, because you're going to have to change work environments around to accommodate that. You and I were talking just before we went on the air. You're already starting to take inventory for industrial space, because here in West Michigan, I'm told, we're pretty close to capacity, and elsewhere in the state we have some of the same issues.
Yeah, well, the number one issue, and we've talked about that a lot, and we may still talk about it, is the talent question. It's not a question about finding a job anymore, it's how do you get the skills to take that good, well-paying job. The same thing is becoming true of our inventory of industrial sites and properties that are ready to go. So although we may have some sites, they may need cleanup still. This is the point of getting the resources to make sure we do those brownfield sites to clean them up, or finding out how to get them consolidated in a big enough parcel they can be used. But we do have that, and so I'm working with the MEDC now of doing a survey across Michigan to find out what's ready to go? And how do we see what's the pipeline of what needs to be brought up to ready to go status in the next couple of years? Because we've got opportunity, and we wouldn't want to lose those great paying jobs because we don't have a place where they could site.
The Detroit Chamber's event on Mackinac Island is coming up, and one of the conversations up there will be about talent, because there are a lot of business leaders who, like you, recognize that we've got a lot of jobs, but we don't necessarily have people with the skills that match up. And you've talked about this for a long time and have now developed something you call the Marshall Plan for Talent. But this is really about getting people trained for jobs that exist right now and we believe will be in the future. Does the state have the kind of resource to put behind a program like that?
We have enough to be the catalyst, and that's what the Marshall Plan is about. We basically want to set aside $100 million for a 5-year program. Is that going to solve the whole issue? No, but it's not just about government. That's part of the change of the Marshall Plan we need to make, Rick, is we have too many silos. We have a K-12 silo, a higher ed silo, we have the business community, we have government, all sort of separate. And if you look at long term, we need to make it much more a public-private partnership where it's more seamless, where you're getting credentials and fields and you're accumulating them over a lifetime. Because quite often everyone spends their time talking about higher ed and how do we help people get those skills once they leave high school. The bigger point in many respects is lifelong learning. Think of anyone that's graduated in the last few years or in the future. They're probably going to have to go through 2 major retrainings at least during their lifetime to stay relevant to their field because of things have changed or go to a new field. Think about other than a few big organizations in our country, who does lifelong learning right? Or where would you go? Again, we've got some great community colleges, but not at the scope and scale to do that for huge numbers of people, because it's all about gaining competencies, gaining new skills, not just from 18 to 22, but from 16 to 75 or 80.
One of the things that people have to adjust to as well is a changing economy means changing jobs, and jobs that people used to think of as being less desirable aren't necessarily so now, because they have changed. That factory job is now a high-skilled job. It's not just a matter of punching widgets or whatever.
No, absolutely not. So industrial automation, robotics in the factory setting, auto technician, welder, plumber, these are all great, well-paying positions. We need more of these, and we need to really get young people and their parents focused in on them, because quite often people are still in that mode of saying you need a 4-year degree. That's not true, first of all. Secondly, I never want to discourage anyone that wants a 4-year degree, but here are some great, well-paying options that are extremely satisfying from a career point of view. Go for it if you want to do it.
One of the biggest questions that everybody who is running for office should be dealing with in this important election cycle, and I know you aren't running, but it's still your issue too, and that is school safety and what we do. Since the most recent horrible attack in Florida, we've seen a lot of emphasis put on it, but the question is, what do we do about it? I know some of the schools in our area have passed bonds and they have done some updating, but still people worry about the safety of students at schools. What should we be doing about that?
There's a whole series of things. So I came out with a school safety plan, and in it, it says we're going to create a task force to do a number of things over time, but there are some short-term things that we can really do. One, we need a school safety plan put in place at every school, and to make sure it gets audited and make sure it's being followed. And that includes things like access controls. We should be doing that anyway. We worry about human trafficking in addition to school shootings to make sure our schools are secure. That's not happening in every place. But one of the biggest things I tell people is, how do we better train staff, students, even students themselves, teachers, administrators, on how to identify a troubled youth? Someone that's feeling isolated. If you look at many cases, there are warning signs in every one of these situations. Quite often there are multiple warning signs. How do we make sure that people know what to look for and know who to go to talk to if they believe they see someone with a problem? We created a hotline several years ago, OK to Say. It's been a huge success. Its biggest area has been helping prevent suicides and then preventing bullying. But it's also helped in these shooter potential situations where it's an anonymous tip line. Not all our students know about it or how it can be used, and how well are all those tips being followed up. So these are all some real-term, near-term things that we can do to help address this situation, and we need to do better.
What has changed from your perspective between the time you and I were in high school, when we didn't see this type of activity by and large, to today? Is that just pressures of a different kind of society?
Yeah, I don't think there's one answer, but one of the things you can clearly see is the impact of social media and everything there. I mean, we didn't have that. You sit around and talk to your friends. But part of the reason you didn't have as many troubled kids, in my view, is you were sitting around talking to friends. Now it's possible, and again, I quite often view the people that are the ones on this path, either to potentially taking their own life or taking someone else's life, is they tend to be isolated. And it's that question, if there was someone not to just hear them, but to listen to them and listen closely enough, knowing that if you hear certain things, who do you pass it on to, or how do you get them connected to somebody that can do an intervention to help them? That's what we really need to do, because again, it's much easier to not be participating with that broad group of friends the way we used to just go hang out.
We're going to wrap this up because we've only got a few minutes left, about a minute and a half, but you've got a few months left in office. We've already talked about
5 dog years, so I'm counting. It makes it sound longer. I get more done.
It does.
And I plan on getting a lot done.
You've talked about a lot of the things here this morning, things that you'd like to see done, obviously, with the autonomous vehicles and more trade deals and the talent. Is there any other big checkoff for you that you would like to get done between now and December?
Well, you said some of it. The talent thing, the other areas, infrastructure. There's still some major improvements we can do there. Again, we were able to make more investments in roads, but I've also talked to the legislature about a water fee to help with water and sewer infrastructure. Also, a tipping fee that would help replace Clean Michigan. We were talking about industrial sites. We have brownfield sites that there's no responsible party to clean them up. They could be great places they're often wonderful locations in terms of physical location. They could be places to put Michiganders, hundreds of thousands of Michiganders to work, but we need to clean them up. We need the resources to do that.
The governor obviously has an ambitious agenda, but with a legislature that seems poised to pass the budget and get out of Lansing for an election season, we'll see how much gets done. The governor did unveil a pilot program looking at underground utilities and other infrastructure earlier this week. If you're interested in that, you can see our story at woodtv.com. And we're back with more To The Point. Welcome back to The Point. This week in Lansing, the legislature continued their work on the budget. We sat down with Grand Rapids Democrat Winnie Brinks to get her take on how the legislature is planning to spend your tax dollars. Representative, let's talk about the budget process. This is at once kind of a streamlined budget process than what we saw 10 years ago. But some have said just because it's quick doesn't mean that it's necessarily the process that you want. Being with the Democrats, I suspect that there are some issues you have. Let's talk first of all just about the process in general. The budgets are scattered out to all of the Appropriations Committee in the House and in the Senate, and they're rolled together in two major budgets, the omnibus and the school bus, as some call it. The House passes their version, Senate passes their version. That's where we are now. Give me your take, first of all, on the larger spending bill that pays for everything outside of education.
Sure. I think that we're seeing budgets that are getting done in a timely fashion, which is always a good thing. I think we're seeing some effort to get out of Lansing early this year because folks have other things on their mind this fall. So, but glad to see that things are running efficiently in terms of that process. However, there's a lot of things in the budgets that we don't have an opportunity to weigh in individually regarding different departments. And so sometimes things can slip in there that are difficult to address.
It is a complex, big, $56 billion budget. And for every member to know what's in every budget would be very difficult. Right. So there is no doubt that when those come to a vote, you have to take the general knowledge from your Appropriations Committee members. Still, as you say, there are sometimes things that surprise folks, but we won't know what the final deal is until the House and Senate reconcile those, and
right.
That probably doesn't happen until after the Revenue Estimating Conference, right?
Right. So we'll see what happens in terms of revenues, what those look like. Any points of difference will, of course, need to be clarified, and they'll work that out in those subcommittees. So it's a relatively small group of people who are actually working on those numbers and then presenting them to our full bodies.
When it comes to school and the school aid fund, Republicans and Democrats almost never agree on
That's right.
what is the appropriate number or how it is appropriately spent.
Yeah.
Same is true again this year. Democrats are not particularly thrilled, while Republicans contend that they put more into this budget for the school aid than ever before. So what's your take?
So my take is that this budget's not worse, I don't think, than the last year's budget. Regarding education, we've seen some decent increases in per pupil funding, so I'm pleased about that. We've however, seen many studies over the last couple of years that are showing that we're underfunding our schools. If we really want to be top 10 in 10, like many of our Lansing colleagues say, we're going to have to take seriously some of those studies that talk about the need to put into additional investments in kids that just face more barriers to education. Things like English language learners and special ed, kids who are facing the issues that poverty brings to their household. So I would really like to see us take seriously some of those studies and those numbers and find a way that we can establish a goal, work on it long term. It's not going to happen in this budget. It's the kind of thing that needs to happen over a number of terms. So I'm optimistic next year in January that we'll be able to start a conversation with a new governor, whomever that is, and a large number of new senators and new representatives, and have that conversation about how do we get from point A to point B, and what is that number? What kind of goal can we establish in a bipartisan way that will adequately fund education so that we can be one of those top performing states?
A couple of things there, but first let's talk about that idea. This is a little different than people have explained to me in the past. A lot of times people have said, we have to do this, we've got to get this done. What you're talking about is first trying to come up with that number. Nobody's ever been able to adequately explain to me what that number is and how much it's going to cost to get to where you want to go.
Right.
So somehow you have to figure that out.
Yeah, exactly. And there's been this study with the school cost study that was recently put out, and it has done by a very reputable firm. They've done it for other states. The states that have followed their recommendations have seen their scores increase. They've seen their performance of their students improve. And right now what we've had is years of reforms that some folks in the legislature think are going to work, and what we've seen is nothing but a constant slide down to the bottom in terms of our education results. So what we're doing now is clearly not working. So I'm very hopeful that if we get a whole new group of legislators in that is as frustrated as I am with the direction our education results have gone, that we can actually see some long-term leadership and some long-term commitment to long-term goals. And that can only happen if you've got some folks who are going to be around for a while, and I think we're in an ideal spot to have those conversations because there is so much turnover, and we will see folks elected this year who will be around for 6 years and for 8 years.
And doing that incrementally, not trying to take it all in one big bite, because the budget, I mean, while the money could theoretically be found, it would be a much heavier lift than if you do it over.
Right. So the latest number from this study was approximately $2,000 per student. So it's a very significant increase if we are somewhere around $7,000 or $8,000 right now. So we need to seriously talk about what number we are willing to prioritize over what period of time and figure out how to do that.
One of the things you talked about as we sat down, I said, hey, what's on your mind? What's going on? And you mentioned that in the conversation this past week, there have been conversations and hearings about work rules for people who are on Medicaid. And before the folks watching at home say, what does that mean? Well, it affects a certain percentage of people. There are some people that aren't capable of working. They have a disability or some other problem. There are a good number of people who already are working. That are on Medicaid. So it's not that this is a blanket proposal. I mean, the rule would be, but it's not that it's going to affect everybody on Medicaid, because many people are already compliant one way or the other. But what is the idea?
So as you mentioned, about 60% of people who are receiving Medicaid nationwide are already working. This proposal would require people to work 29 hours or more in order to be eligible for Medicaid, and that's a much higher number than any other state that's actually implemented these kinds of requirements. So there's some concern there with that. But the idea that in order to receive basic health care that you must be working nearly 30 hours a week is what's been proposed. So there obviously are issues with that in terms of people not being able to work for various reasons. Sometimes it's because they're taking care of other folks in their family. Sometimes it's because they're not capable. So even with the carve-outs that have been suggested for disability or for pregnancy, those kinds of things, there's still multiple problems with this bill, and it really I think the bottom line for me, and given my career and working with people, helping them get jobs and keep jobs in terms of workforce development and job retention, the lack of access to health care has been something that keeps people from working. So to now take it away as a punishment for not working, I think they have it backwards. And so I think that's one of those barriers we need to be working on to get people to work. We need to make sure that they have access to that basic health care.
You mentioned something that kind of feeds into one of the curiosities that I've been thinking about. This past week, national unemployment rate is 3.9%. That's the lowest it's been, I think, in my lifetime.
Yeah, very low.
But wages don't seem to be going up. And maybe there's a lag, and maybe they will. I don't know. I'm not an economist. But we still know that there are a lot of people that are working more than one job, and that there are people who have worked for a considerable time without wages catching up. As somebody who worked in the field of jobs, how significant of a problem is that? And is there anything other than market forces that can move that?
Well, certainly, the efforts to raise the minimum wage could certainly help bring some folks on the bottom up. The earned income tax credit rewards work, and it provides working families with an additional income that helps bring them out of poverty. It's probably the single most effective policy that we could implement. And here in Michigan in the last few years, all we've seen is cuts to the earned income tax credit and a reduction in that. So we don't even match the federal amount that's given anymore at the state level. And that could be something that is very easy to do, and it's very easy to implement as well, because if you qualify for the federal, we know that you qualify for the state. So one of the other problems with this proposal recently with the work requirements is that it would create a $30 million, at least, some say $50 million bureaucracy just to implement it, just to monitor. So you'd have to have a whole system of people being able to check in with DHHS, report any changes in their hours. So you'd have a messy system that needs to be invented and then implemented. And I think, if you have to report any change in your hours or any dip below 29 hours within 10 days, it only takes the flu to go through your house once. If you've got a part-time job without any paid sick time, you could be gone for a couple of days or 5 days and end up with you're not meeting your requirement and being cut off of your health care then at the time when you may need it most. So it's an interesting proposal with multiple problems, and it seems that the Republicans who are proposing it are really it's just really hard to look at it in any other way than it's an effort to reduce their cost of Medicaid to the state by removing health care from people. And I think that they're going in the wrong direction when it comes to that. We should be trying to make sure that more people have health care.
We're almost out of time. You were talking about the DEQ, and I know that everything dealing with the environment right now, particularly here in West Michigan, and frankly around the state. I mean, it's a much larger problem when we talk about these emerging contaminants such as we've seen. But without getting too far down that path, there is a proposal with the DEQ that would set up a commission that you're not wild about.
Yeah, I'm not wild about it. It would basically put industry in charge of regulating itself. And so corporations that go to the DEQ and ask for permission to be able to pollute a certain amount have to request that permission from the DEQ and get a permit. What this would do is allow that commission that's pretty much stacked with industry leaders and representatives to be able to approve their own permits. And if the DEQ didn't like a permit and said, no, you shouldn't do that, they would have the ability to overrule the DEQ. And so what you really have there is industry regulating itself. And corporations, rightfully, have shareholders' interests in mind, and they are there to make money and to do a good business. That's all good, but they don't represent the interests of the people. It is not their mission to protect the environment. That's what the DEQ is for.
The House and the Senate will still have to reconcile their two budgets. It probably won't be done until the next revenue estimating conference later this month. We're back with more To the Point. A couple of program notes this morning. On Wednesday, I hope you'll join us at 7 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for our first debate of this election cycle. The Republican candidates for governor will join me as we talk about the topics that will face the next governor of the state of Michigan. That's Wednesday at 7 o'clock on Wood TV. And next Sunday morning, make note, we'll be here, but we'll be here at 9 a.m. instead of 10. So next Sunday at 9. We'll see you then. To the Point.